Hi, my name is Sally Loftis. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers, and I'm excited to join you today for this session. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides and we'll get going. Today, we're going to talk about talent investment and nonprofit pay, a study in the arts community. And just to introduce myself, again, my name is Sally Loftis. I'm the managing director of Loftis Partners, a human resources consulting firm. We are actually based in North Carolina, if you already couldn't pick up on my accent. But while I'm mentioning North Carolina, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Catawba and Cherokee communities here as we gather on their unceded land, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. So I'm curious as we get started. We're going to be talking a lot about pay today and base pay. Do you know how your base pay is determined? So if you have a job right now, and what key factors does your organization use to determine your base pay? So be thinking about that. We're really going to talk a lot about it. An overview of the base of kind of this particular presentation is that this is part of my thesis that I conducted as part of the Master's of Science in Organization Development program at Pepperdine University. I had the opportunity to conduct action research at an arts nonprofit here in the United States. When this nonprofit received a transformational endowment gift, that part of that money was set aside for employee engagement. If you want to read more about my thesis or actually read the whole thing, I've included the link down here for further exploration. Here's kind of where we're going today, our agenda and learning intentions, is I'm going to introduce you to nonprofit pay structures, particularly kind of a more traditional one and some of the philosophies there. Then I'm going to discuss the specific research that I did at this arts nonprofit. Then I'm going to share with you the recommendations that I made that we actually instituted at this nonprofit. And then I'm going to link the implications for organization development. Sometimes people see pay as something that's just really more human resources, but it really is connected to organization development. So we have an image here on the screen of a triangle, and the title is Traditional Nonprofit Pay-Based Structure. And typically in a triangle, what's on the bottom is kind of more foundational than what's on the top. And that's true when you look at base pay structure here. Typically, when people are determining pay, they're going to start with government rates. And what I mean there are things like minimum wage, Fair Labor Standard Act, some federal components there. Also, sometimes there can be state and local components. And typically in nonprofits, a nonprofit organization may start looking around at their peers. They may do a salary survey with peer organizations. They may look at industry compensation reports. And they may also use 990 form information, which is the public filing that a nonprofit organization does with the IRS on an annual basis. And typically the highest paid employee's salary is included on that form. So as we were doing research, and we're going to get more into my research in a minute, we knew this was kind of at this arts nonprofit, that was the structure, and it was one that we certainly used, but we started looking at other structures and maybe if we could find an alternative one. And we came across something called a talent investment philosophy. And this was created by Rusty Stahl, who is now working with Fund the People. And I'm going to include a link to that website and his information at the end of this presentation. However, Rusty says in his talent investment philosophy is that funders to nonprofits and charities have done a really good job of giving money to programs and buildings and things like that, but they haven't always been willing to give money for staff at a nonprofit. And his theory is that when you invest in nonprofit staff, and if you look at the image that's on the page right now, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the bottom left-hand corner. When you invest in staff, you create a pro-talent culture. And a pro-talent culture has some different elements to it, like recruitment, retention, growth, workplace norms, really culture. And what happens is when you create a pro-talent culture, that gives you high staff morale and engagement. And if studies have shown when staff are engaged, then they're going to perform better. And when staff performs better, obviously the organization performs better, and there's going to be a greater impact on the community. So let's use an everyday example here of a nonprofit. I'm going to use an animal shelter. really because you're going to see a picture of my dog later. So it's on my mind. But if a funder gives money to a nonprofit who then invests it in their staff, so again, kind of in that bottom left corner here, if there's a pro talent culture at this nonprofit, what happens is the people who work at that animal shelter are going to stay and they're going to do their jobs well. And then the organization is going to perform better. So what does that look like? Probably placing more animals in loving homes. Well, that's the greater impact. So if they're doing well, they may be able to grow. So then they can place more animals into loving homes. And because of that success, they may get more resources. So that's really kind of the structure behind the talent investment philosophy. So what did we do at our arts nonprofit? We knew we kind of had a pay problem, and I want to talk about how we knew that in a few minutes. But in August 2018 is when we started this work. This is whenever we received news of our transformational endowment gift. And we received a $25 million endowment gift, which is a pretty big gift for a small nonprofit. At the time, our endowment was $16 million. And what that meant kind of on a day-to-day operational budget perspective is that we got an extra $1.25 million into a $6 million operating budget. Now, some of this money was to replace some previous grants, but we were able to set aside some of that money to focus on employee engagement. And the executive director at the time and myself, and I was employed as the human resources manager at this nonprofit, and others internally and externally were able to help us think about, oh my goodness, we have all this money, what can we do for staff? And there were two questions that really were in our minds constantly is how do we use this money well for the intended purposes? Because we certainly knew we could spend the money, but we wanted to know that we had done it effectively. So how did we measure our success there? And that's kind of how this study started. So what happened? So I will tell you in August 2018, I have to admit when this news came out, I didn't know this was going to be what my thesis was on, but I was also starting grad school at the time. So it seemed like a good link. So kind of for the next 6 months, I did some research with my partners. I worked closely with the board personnel committee to look at what could we do with this new money and do it well and address some of the issues we already knew we had around pay and benefits from previous employee engagement surveys. So after some time of research, we decided to use structural interventions. And I have a source here from Erica Foldy, who's a professor at NYU, who talks about the different ways you can engage employees. One of them is programming. Another one is structural intervention and interventions. And that's what this is. So you'll see here, we decided to raise pay to living wages, align the staffing structure with program needs. So what happened there is that our programs had grown, but we had not kind of grown our staff to meet those needs. And then we needed to build a solid internal infrastructure. Infrastructure had grown, but we had not grown staff capacity around that. So we started making all of these changes about 6 months after we found out about the endowment gift. So about 6 months after that, I came onto the scene as part of my thesis and decided to do some research. And I used action research, which is a series of cycles. And so I had 3 cycles of feedback. One was an online survey that was going to be available to all employees. I didn't really ask much demographic information, just that they were employed at the time. Then we did focus groups with non-supervisory employees. And this was really important to me because in my literature review, I found that there had been much more research around pay for nonprofit leaders and leadership development, but not really any around frontline workers. And I wanted to get that information out there. And then we also conducted individual interviews with supervisory employees. So for supervisors, they could not only give their individual data around how these structural interventions had impacted them, but also we could hear from them how that impacted the whole team. So this is kind of the cycles we went through over a 3-month period. So here's a little more detail about my research design, that online survey. The survey that we used was one we had participated in about 15 months before we did this again, and it was based on the national study of the changing workforce through the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM. And of course, in the thesis, you can see the actual questions and the responses, but we knew that we had lower scores around wages, benefits, and opportunities to advance. So we felt like doing this survey again about 15 months later would be a good measure for us. The second cycle was around focus groups, which you can see the questions listed here. And the third cycle was around individual interviews with those supervisors. And there's my dog. And he's wondering, what did the participants say? So after we did all this research, what happened? So in the survey, what was great is one, we had wonderful participation from staff. Two is that we pretty much had an increase in all the categories across the board, which was great because we could definitely tell there had been an increase in employee satisfaction. We also saw some significant bumps, increases around the questions on pay and benefits. Surprisingly, we also saw an increase in supervisor level and support, like people's trust in them. We actually had one question where we had 100% of staff agree that their supervisors supported them. But we also knew there was still work to do. Specifically, you'll see here, but I'm going to talk here around opportunities for advancement. In the focus groups, we really wanted to get down and say, what pay, when is pay enough? How much are you getting paid enough? And people just really were saying, I just want to be able to pay my bills every day and just live my life. I'm not trying to live some rich lifestyle. I just want to be able to pay my day-to-day bills. And that was connected to their benefits too. Something else that employees said is that their advancement opportunities were rare, which we're going to talk about later. And then within the interviews, we got great feedback from the supervisors. They had said, yes, I can see a difference within my employees on my team. We definitely have more capacity, which we needed. I can see my staff being less stressed, but I don't want us to stop here. We still have work to do. So based on that data, what were the recommendations that we came up with? And we came up with 3 of these that I'm going to go into more detail. Number 1 is organization planning with minimum wage. 2 is cost of living as a key pay factor. And 3 is a pay raise system linked to employee development. So let's start with that number 1, that organization planning with minimum wage. So here you see the image on the right, again, of that traditional nonprofit pay-based structure. And I'm curious if you know what your state's minimum wage might be. And I realize you may live in a state that has a different one than what your city or municipality has. But I live in North Carolina. So our federal minimum wage rate is $7.25 an hour. And our state rate is $7.25 an hour. So what we realized in our research is that it didn't seem like minimum wage was going to increase anytime soon. So we had to make an intentional decision as an organization to have an internal minimum wage that we would continue to increase ourselves. And this was really driven by looking at our frontline workers. So I have a couple of examples here. A housekeeper that worked full-time, working $10 an hour, was only making $20,800 a year. A maintenance technician, again, full-time, and a maintenance technician being somebody who may come fix a sink, or if electricity goes out, making $14 an hour, they're still only making $29,120 a year. So that's one thing we knew, is that people weren't making a ton of money. What else did we know? We started looking at that the cost of living was connected to that. So first we looked at the US and how much did it cost to live within the United States across the board, whether you were single or had multiple people in your house, not dependent on your income. And we looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and were shocked to find out that the cost for basic necessities, and this is in 2018, knowing that this data has changed significantly with the COVID-19 pandemic, with cost going up, is that cost was $51,905. That was a big difference from somebody making $20,000 and the cost of living in general being almost close to $52,000. We were shocked. So what we started realizing is that the cost of living needed to be a key factor in the way we determine pay. And not only that, is that it needed to be towards the bottom of that pyramid that you can see on this slide. Just to give you an example, basic necessity costs, that's housing, food, transportation, healthcare. An example of specifically where we looked at our locale, is that the average 2-bedroom apartment, the rent was $683 a month. For those of you who live in big cities, that may seem low, but it was pretty expensive for where we were. And when you go back to that housekeeper and that maintenance technician that I mentioned before, the housekeeper making $10 an hour couldn't afford to live where our nonprofit was located. And the maintenance technician making $14 an hour could barely live there. So we're starting to see some issues with this traditional nonprofit structure. So we decided that we needed to change it. And here's what we did, is we changed the pyramid a little bit. We decided to keep those government rates or those US employment laws in there because of course we were going to abide by the law, but we felt like cost of living really needed to be a bigger factor than these other things. Also, based on our research, we saw a lot of pay equity and disparity within nonprofits, and specifically around gender, race and ethnicity, other intersectional identities. We also wanted to still look at the job market and then look at diversity, and that really was linked to our job descriptions, which I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So why did we structure our base pay structure this way? Because when you look at the cost of living, we were able to look at our local economic outlook. So for instance, if we use the COVID-19 pandemic, there are some foods that have gone up 40% in cost over the last year because of the pandemic, because of disrupted supply chains. So, I mean, that could be a huge thing for people. They may be able to work for you, but in a year not be able to work for you because of what's going on in the economy. Pay equity and disparity. That's something we looked at. Is we didn't ask people, we decided to stop asking people their salary histories, because if they came from a place that paid low, we were only perpetuating those same low salaries. We also just decided to say, this is what we're going to pay. And if you made way below that, good for you. The next piece was looking at the job market, is that we really wanted to be competitive. We realized we just weren't as competitive. When we were competitive, some of the ways we could become competitive beyond pay were around benefits with flexibility and autonomy. And you see that today with remote work options and flexible schedules. And then the last piece was diversity, around broadening our criteria and recognizing our unconscious bias. Broadening that criteria is that there were some job descriptions where we required somebody to have a bachelor's degree. And we realized that was knocking some people out who may have had relevant work experience. Sometimes I have seen that in my years in human resources, where people who've been in the military or veterans are coming in to interview, and those who are interviewing them have a hard time translating that work experience over, even though it's just as much or more as someone who has a bachelor's degree in that same area of work. And we also recognize that we had a lot of unconscious bias, and we needed to overcome that ourselves. So the last recommendation was looking at a pay raise system linked to employee development. And if you'll remember, our employees told us in those focus groups that the opportunities for advancement were rare. And part of that impact to them was about raising their own pay. They really felt like the only way to get a big bump in pay was to change jobs. And so we decided that we needed to give people multiple pathways to getting more money. Now, if you went up a tier, obviously you may get a bigger bump, but you could still stay in the same job and continue to increase your pay. And the pathways that we decided on were longevity, skills development, job expansion, and special projects. And I want to highlight here something that I typically say, because I still do pay equity assessments, salary studies in my consulting firm, and work a lot with equity, diversity, inclusion, is that a diverse pay raise system with inclusive pathways provides more equitable outcomes for employees. It really is a practice of inclusion. So what are the implications for organization development? When I think of organization development, I'll lean towards organization design, which is one of my specialties, and people and rewards. This is looking at Jay Galbraith's STAR model here on the screen. And there are 5 components of that. But when you look at people and rewards, those 2 pieces, pay is directly connected to these 2 pieces. So when you're starting to work on pay, you're changing the design in 2 out of the 5 pieces of that STAR model. And something else I have found, as I said, in doing these equity assessments and getting deeper into equity inclusion work, is that pay is a linchpin system for equity, diversity, inclusion, because pay impacts everyone. And it really can make a huge difference with your staff. And there are so many, I hope you've seen at least some of the systems of oppression that can be baked in to pay structure. But as we continue to dismantle those systems, pay can be something that really can make a huge difference for staff. I feel like I've gone through this super fast, but there certainly are more materials here. And I've given you a link for my website where you can find a PDF copy of my slides and a references list. And I'll also include the link to my thesis. But I also encourage you, if you have questions or want to talk about it more, feel free to email me. My email address is here on the screen, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there and would love to talk more. Thank you so much for being with me today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.